My name is Brody Miller. I'm a veterinarian for Texas Animal Health Commission. I work out of the Beeville office. Have worked hand in hand with many of you in this room over the last several years as Texas has dealt with the challenges of chronic wasting disease. I want to say thank you to our hosts. Thank you for everyone who put the meeting together. Thank you to our speakers yesterday. It was a great day yesterday, I thought. Some great information. We actually listened to 12 different speakers yesterday. And they presented a lot of highly technical data, but in a way that was understandable and frankly, what I thought was encouraging. So I want to remind everybody that veterinarians who want CE for the meeting, remember to sign in on the sign-in sheet back there and take care of that part. And also we have the question cards at the back. If you have questions that you want the speakers to answer during the panel discussion, please go get a card, write down your question, and put it in the box. Our first speaker this morning is Mitch Lockwood. Mitch has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Wildlife and Fishery Sciences from Texas A&M. Thank you. Got his start as a wildlife biologist for Florida Game and Fish Commission at the Blackwater Wildlife Management Area. Moved back to Texas in 2000 to work for Parks and Wildlife as a private lands biologist in the Hill Country. Mitch became the Whitetail Deer Program Leader in 2004 and the Big Game Program Director in 2009. Mitch was also co-chair of the state's CWD Task Force and lead author on the state's CWD Management Plan that was updated just prior to the index case in 2012. Mitch Lockwood.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, and good morning to all of you. I'm glad to see that you survived yesterday. And for those of you that were not able to join us yesterday, you missed out. It was a good day, a lot of really good, a lot of valuable information shared yesterday, a lot of very important information that was shared yesterday. The good news is that you'll have another opportunity to view those presentations. In fact, I guess an unlimited number of opportunities, since that information, all those presentations will be posted online here in a few weeks. This morning, I have the privilege to share with you a rather unique data set. And I say unique because we're the only state in the country that has incorporated ante-mortem testing or live animal testing as part of the surveillance program for our deer breeding program in this state. This is a topic for which I have a lot of passion. I became very, very interested in ante-mortem testing several years ago, to the point where I wanted to find a way to incorporate it into our statewide surveillance program for the deer breeding program for a couple of reasons. Number one, to increase surveillance. But number two, to get quite a few of our deer breeders in the state out of the proverbial mousetrap. And I'll discuss that in more detail here in a little bit. But when I began these discussions several years ago, it was not a popular topic, not within any circle, not amongst my own peers throughout the country, not in any regulatory circle, not in any circle involving the captive deer industry. It just was not a popular topic for one reason. There was no validated test. There still isn't. And still to this day, it's a controversial topic in at least some circles, or at least the application of it can be controversial. Like, do you use ante-mortem testing to clear an individual deer on a not detected test result? Or should you incorporate the genotypes of the deer before you consider how you're going to apply these test results? Or should you involve or incorporate longitudinal testing before you use these test results to make management decisions? But there's so much potential with this tool to fill in the gaps for a surveillance program that quite frankly provided very little confidence of early detection of this disease in these facilities. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a graph that shows the number of deer in permitted deer breeding facilities in Texas from report year 2005 to report year 2014. This is the number of deer that was in all of these facilities at some point during those report years. 2014 ended, that report year ended just 3 months prior to the detection of chronic wasting disease in what is commonly referred to as the index facility in this state. This yellow or orangish line along near the bottom of this graph illustrates the number of mortalities that were reported in these facilities during that same time frame. At first glance, this graph shows me that waiting to test deer that die in a facility is not a recipe for early detection, which, as we heard yesterday, is critical for containment of the disease. This graph represents 4.5% of the adult population. All the data you see on this graph, the bars and the line, only represent deer that are at least 16 months of age or older, deer that we consider to be test eligible for chronic wasting disease. Those mortalities, that line represents 4.5% of that adult population. So let's put this into perspective. The majority of deer breeding facilities in this state have 50 or fewer deer. So let's just say 50 deer. That means on average, they're losing 2.25 animals a year to death. We'll say 3. So let's say all 3 of those animals get tested. That's not adequate for early detection of this disease. As Dr. Samuel shared with us yesterday, that probability detection table, if you want to have 99% confidence that you will detect the disease in a herd of 50 animals where 1 out of every 10 animals is infected, which is at a much higher prevalence rate than we have seen in any of the facilities here in Texas, you need 27 samples. You can't get there with 3 mortalities in a year. So clearly, for early detection of this disease, we needed another tool other than just waiting to test deer that die in these facilities. But there's another reason why I think this tool was very important. I mentioned a few minutes ago, to help some breeders, actually quite a few breeders, get out of what's referred to as this mouse trap. What happens to a deer breeder who misses a mortality that he's got to test to stay movement qualified? And what do I mean by movement qualified? I mean qualified to move deer. If you have a not movement qualified status in this state, you cannot receive deer into your facility or transfer deer out of your facility. It's essentially a quarantine or a hold order. And if you have some testing requirement to test some proportion of mortalities, whether that be 20% of them, 50% of them, 100% of them, and you miss enough mortalities to drop you below that requirement and you're not movement qualified, how do you get out of that trap? How do you get movement qualified again? Currently, there are 179 facilities in this state that are in that situation. They have a not movement qualified status because of inadequate surveillance. Well, in Texas, there's a law that allows deer breeders to euthanize animals for disease testing purposes. And theoretically, a deer breeder could euthanize enough animals to get enough test results in some cases to get back to a movement qualified status. But with each animal that's euthanized, they're increasing the number of mortalities for that facility, and therefore increasing the number of test results for that facility. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a requirement to test 20% of your adult mortalities, and you have 10 mortalities for that year in your facility, and you test 1. Or you might have tested more than 1, but you get some inconclusive test results. But you have 1 valid, not detected test result. Well, you need 2 if the requirement's 20%, right? So the law in Texas lets you go euthanize a deer to get that second test result. But once you euthanize that deer, you now have 11 mortalities. And 20% of 11 is more than 2. So now you need to test another animal, euthanize another animal to have tested. In this example, you would euthanize 2 animals to get back to that movement qualified status. But what if the requirement's more than 20%? What if it's 50%, 80%, or more? You can see where there's a point that you would reach, actually in many cases, to where you can't euthanize your way out of this mousetrap. And there's no way to get out of a movement qualified status without some other surveillance tool there. And I believe ante-mortem testing is one of those tools that can get you there. And we have applied it that way in this state, as you'll see. So limiting surveillance to post-mortem sampling creates significant challenges for deer breeding facilities to remain movement qualified, or it requires regulatory officials to compromise the integrity of the CWD surveillance program and put industries at risk. So now that we have 2.5 years of ante-mortem testing under our belts and quite a bit of data, let's take a look and see what some of that looks like. Most of what I have to share with you this morning is just some descriptive stats, some things that I find pretty interesting from all this ante-mortem testing. You can see that we have test results for over 31,000 deer for the past couple of years. Most of those are from rectal biopsies. We did have one facility that did a whole herd test of medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes real early on in the game. And then there were a couple other CWD positive facilities that tested a few deer with medial retropharyngeal lymph node biopsies. You can see there's not nearly as many tonsil biopsies as there are rectal biopsies. And as we learned yesterday, that's a more preferred tissue for early detection, but it's more costly to do tonsil biopsies. You don't have to anesthetize animals to get a good rectal biopsy, but you do with a tonsil biopsy. I say you don't have to. It depends on what kind of facility that you have, assuming you have a way to physically restrain animals. But tonsil biopsies could be more expensive, and so most of these 5,400 samples that you see on the slide here are from facilities that are either CWD positive facilities or they're trace facilities, trace in facilities or trace out facilities, or you may say trace forward or trace backward facilities from a CWD positive facility. They're facilities that are operating under a herd plan because of implications of CWD. And that herd plan would require tonsil biopsy over rectal biopsies. Now, there's different reasons why deer breeders in this state choose to ante-mortem test. The vast majority of them ante-mortem test to increase in status in this herd. And so, briefly, I'll try and get everybody up to speed on this. There's different movement statuses in the state. I already talked about being movement qualified or not movement qualified, but there's also statuses of, let's just say, relative disease risk or disease surveillance history, if you will. We have what we call transfer category 1, 2, or 3 status, or I'll just say TC1, TC2, and TC3, with TC1 being the highest status or the status of least relative risk because of the CWD surveillance for that facility. And there are more privileges that come with that higher status. You know, when we first detected CWD in the index facility, we thought, okay, I showed you the graph a minute ago that showed we don't have many mortalities in these facilities, so how do you increase that surveillance? Well, one of the obvious ways to increase that surveillance, not necessarily in the facility, but for the facilities, is to test deer after they're liberated and harvested by hunters, which is required in almost every other state that has a captive server program. But that's not a real popular idea here. And so we thought, okay, what are some other ways to get there? And obviously ante-mortem testing is one. Well, there's a carrot. Basically, we use this ante-mortem testing as a carrot to increase that surveillance on the front end and not have to require that increased surveillance on the back end on the release site. So if you get to this TC1 status, you don't have to have testing post-mortem of hunter-harvested deer on that site. And so ante-mortem testing is one way that you could get to that status. And so that early on was we had a big push in rectal biopsies primarily for folks wanting to achieve TC1 status. Here I have what we call substitution, which today is the primary reason why facilities are conducting ante-mortem testing. Remember that mousetrap I talked about? They missed a mortality in their facility or more mortalities in their facility. How do they get out? They can use ante-mortem testing to test their way back into a movement qualified status. Now, it's not a one-for-one trade because a seemingly healthy living deer in the facility, a sample from a seemingly healthy deer in the facility, is not nearly as valuable, obviously, as a sample from a deer that died of natural causes in that facility. And so we have a substitution rate that we allow at a 3-for-1 ratio. If you're missing one post-mortem test result, you can ante-mortem test 3 deer to get back to that movement qualified status. If you're missing 9, 27 ante-mortem test results, and so on. And then finally, as you see, there are over 7,600 samples that were a result of either herd plans or they're just surplus test results. Because as I'll share with you here in a minute, there are, especially early on, quite a few test results that had an insufficient number of lymphoid follicles to get a reliable test result, to be able to perform that diagnostic test. And so deer breeders knew about this, and they would request a few extra samples be collected in their facility, and so they would have a surplus. And in some cases, that surplus would be used for substitution purposes, but in other cases, they just remain surplus samples. This graph here shows you kind of the chronology of ante-mortem testing in this state. We have 2016, 2017, 2018, and these are our report years rather than our calendar years, which run from April through March. And you can see there in the latter part of report year 2016, we had a big push of what was actually TC1 upgrades, ante-mortem testing. And since then, once over 2/3 of the industry received, in fact, I think it's more like 3/4, received that TC1 status, today we are more what I'm going to call a maintenance mode, where almost all these samples are for those substitution purposes. Now, this tool has helped us detect the disease, primarily in facilities where we already know the disease to exist, but it's helping us manage the disease in these facilities. It's helping detect the disease in pens where the disease wasn't properly previously detected, and then proper management action could take place from there. But this tool has actually helped us detect the disease in a new facility where we didn't know it to exist before. And that was from somebody trying to get to that TC1 status. So he was acquiring enough rectal biopsy samples to get to TC1, and it was that process that actually detected the disease in that facility. Now, the next few slides I'll use to help talk a little bit about the number, what I'm going to call the inconclusive test results that we've seen over the years. The inconclusive test result basically is one where there were not a sufficient number of follicles to perform that diagnostic test. And when you look at this slide, you think, oh, wow, rectal biopsies are not good. Tonsil biopsies are going to be a lot more reliable. But you remember from a previous slide, there were a lot more rectal biopsies collected. Actually, the proportion of samples with insufficient number of follicles is actually a little bit higher in the tonsil biopsies. But they're both in that 5 to 6% range. But what's interesting to me is for rectal biopsies, our data support what you can find in the literature, and that is as deer get older, you're going to have more samples with an insufficient number of follicles. The average age of all deer that we have rectal biopsies for was 44.45 months. And then the average age of those with an inconclusive rectal biopsy is over 58 months. So again, this is supported in the literature. And if you look at this graphically, you'll see each year here across the x-axis, we have deer that are 1 to 2 years old, 2 to 3 years old, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, and 6+ years old. With each year of age, you're having an increasing number or proportion of samples with insufficient number of follicles. And this is a significant difference across these age classes. We don't see this same trend for tonsil biopsies. With tonsil biopsies, our average age was about 48 months, and the average age of inconclusives was 49.67 months, and we just don't see the same trend. We do see in both rectal and tonsil that the deer with a positive test result tend to be younger than the average, and I'm not sure if there's something noteworthy to that or not. And then finally, on this subject, look at how the number of inconclusives really dropped off and then plateaued throughout 2017 and 2018. Some of this is just experience, more experience with all of our collectors out there. But right here at the beginning of quarter 4 in 2016, our partners over at the diagnostic lab gave us some pretty helpful information that we shared with the whole industry. And it had to do with the size of sample that was collected. Those samples that were about the size of a dime, I'll say, were more likely to have an insufficient number of follicles. But those that were closer to the size of a quarter, maybe a little larger, were more likely to have a sufficient number of follicles. And so we shared that with the industry through an e-blast, and overnight, we saw the number of samples with insufficient follicles just drop through the floor. So that was very helpful information. And then finally, I'll just touch on this slide a little bit and not steal Dr. Rollo's thunder. She's going to go in a whole lot more detail on deer that in CWD positive facilities for which we have ante-mortem and post-mortem test results. Statewide, there's over 3,700 deer that we have both ante-mortem and post-mortem test results. 81 of those are positive animals, as I recall. And this slide shows you 93 test results there in the bottom right, but that represents 81 different deer. Some deer have been tested multiple times, or there's multiple tissue types that were collected, like there may have been tonsil and rectal biopsies collected for individual animals. But what's kind of interesting, I think, is it can be hard to read, but what we have is our post-mortem test results across the top, and down the y-axis here on the left, we have our ante-mortem test results. So there's 15 deer that were not detected through an OBEX test result, OBEX only, but were positive with either medial retropharyngeal lymph node or tonsil biopsies. This is not a complete data set that I'm sharing here, and Dr. Rollo's will be much more complete. But this should not be a surprise to anybody who was here to see the presentations yesterday. It's not a surprise to have a tonsil or lymph node, or even, tonsil or lymph node positive and an OBEX negative. What might surprise you is the one deer that was not detected in both the OBEX and the medial retropharyngeal lymph node, but was tonsil positive. Ante-mortem tonsil positive, post-mortem lymph node not detected. That's pretty interesting. And this number may be a little bit off today too, but one thing that might be at first glance a concern to some is the several deer that were not detected through ante-mortem testing, but positive through post-mortem testing. And the thought is, well, did we miss it with the ante-mortem testing? And there are a few of those animals that were not, I was about to say ante-mortem tested and post-mortem tested on the same day. I think a better way to put it is we collected what I'm going to call ante-mortem tissues the same day that they were post-mortem tested. We took some tonsil sample, we took some rectal sample, et cetera. And there were some where those ante-mortem tissues tested not detected and we had post-mortem positive. But most of these animals that are represented in that 42 number died quite some time after the ante-mortem test. But there were more than 24 that died within 6 months of that ante-mortem test. And I chose 6 months because that's the length of time that those deer, if released, could have been harvested in that year with our long seasons that we have here and still have been tested. And there were a number of them that tested positive after being harvested by hunters 1 month later, 3 months later, 4 months later. But we don't really know that the ante-mortem test missed that positive. We don't know that they would have tested positive with a post-mortem test the day they were ante-mortem tested. And so there's still a lot to learn in that regard. And so as I close my presentation, I'll bring this slide back up that I shared with you earlier that shows the number of deer in the facilities, the number of mortalities in the facilities from report years 05 to 14. And now I'll overlay a red line even lower on this graph that represents the number of samples that were collected or the number of test results that were received for those facilities from that time. Now, I think I mentioned this earlier, or if not, it probably became obvious that for a long time, for this entire period, the requirement in Texas for postmortem sampling of deer and deer breeding facilities was only 20% of those adult mortalities. But this line actually represents closer to 40% for most of those years. But again, as I shared with you earlier, testing 100% of those animals just isn't a recipe for early detection. And my final slide will show you the last 3 years of surveillance, and you can see how the number of samples that have received, the number of CWD test results that we've received has skyrocketed amongst captive deer or permitted deer breeding facilities in this state because of ante-mortem testing. From 05 to 14, we had a total of about 26,000 test results from all the facilities in the state. We got more than that in report year 2016. We got over 27,000 test results that 1 year, and over 21,000 of them were from ante-mortem tests that were performed. And so, again, it's not a real popular topic in some of the circles that I enter from time to time. Again, because there's not a validated test result, and Dr. Nichols certainly has put a lot of work towards getting us there. But we're missing out. I think we're really missing out by not utilizing it. And we were in Texas missing out by not utilizing this technique for so many years. Look at how much this surveillance has improved, how much more confidence that we're able to have that we can detect this disease where it occurs in these facilities. And so with that, I'll conclude my presentation and turn it over to Dr. Rollo.